Americans love to travel in Europe, and who doesn't, honestly? When you go to Europe, you're like, oh, wine is cheap, weather is good, life is awesome. But what Americans don't often consider is the financial aspects. They assume that they're very similar versus they're actually really different. Same with a lot of Europeans. They see salaries in the US and they're like, holy heck, that's a lot of money. That's way more money than I make. I should move to the US and work and do a similar job, but in America. And what they don't consider is that also the expenses are different. And this video will go through a bunch of the main examples between the two. And hi, if you're new to the channel, my name is Tero. I'm a fungi-loving entrepreneur originally from Finland, and this is my YouTube channel, The Spore, where I share lessons I've learned along my life about different things from health and wellness to entrepreneurship. But a very common topic that I've talked a lot about is the cultural differences of being born and raised in Europe and now living the last decade in the US. And I have made multiple videos. A lot of people love them. This one will be focused on the finances, particularly between US and Europe. In Europe, besides Finland, where I was born and raised, I've lived in 4 other countries: France, UK, Switzerland, and Italy. And in the US, I've lived in mostly large cities: New York, LA, Austin. This is somewhat relevant because, yes, finances change depending on where in Europe, where in the US you live. If you're in rural countryside anywhere, it's cheaper than in a metropolitan area. Also, probably your income is lower. So I'll try to do some generalization, but mostly talk about my experiences. Now, that might be different than your experiences or someone else's experiences, but hopefully it helps you better understand the differences between these two regions. In this video, I'm gonna use euros and US dollars interchangeably. When I was living in Europe, euro was about 20 to 25% more valuable than the dollar, which made a significant difference. Now they're like pretty close. There's some fluctuation, but in this video, I'm just gonna kind of use them universally. But you could bump up the euro numbers a little up to make them comparable to dollars. Euros are worth more than dollars, but for this exercise, I don't think they're materially different. So I'm gonna approach my finances from like a business owner, like a P&L, profit and loss statement, income statement, and start from the top and go down. So starting with gross revenue, in this case, gross salary. In the United States, you're expected to probably earn at least the double what you would earn in Europe. And the further you're in a career, it can go as high as like 3 to 5 times higher. This is true, by the way, for CEOs of public listed companies in a lot of cases. But starting when I graduated from college, I was making a little over 2,000 euros a month, which is a good average starting salary. If you had a law degree or a medical degree, you would be making about 4,000 euros a month. Now, if you compare that, that's like barely the average salary of a blue-collar worker in the US, or actually probably less. If you graduate with a good degree, you would be earning less than an average blue-collar worker in the US. The further you advance in your career, this difference just actually keeps growing. So you will earn much more in the US than in Europe. Yes, in Europe, you do get salary raises, bumps up, but like not that much. Very common if you want to work for a prestigious company, I don't know, like Google, and you work there a long time. Sure, you do get stock options that might be worth nicely, but the base salary is like probably less than $100,000 versus in the US at that point, you might be making $200,000, if not more. It's not uncommon that in the US, you would be making multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, if you look at the total population, it's a small percentage. Average salaries in Europe are pretty good, but in the US, there's more diversity, bigger spread, and there is really no ceiling in the US versus in Europe, there definitely is a ceiling. Now, within Europe, there's also differences. Like I was working in Finland and I'd been promoted into a manager and I was making just under 4,000 euros a month, which there was an amazing salary, and was looking to take a job in Spain and my salary would be cut to like 1,500 euros a month. So like Spain, for example, the salaries are lower. Then I moved to Switzerland and was doing a fairly comparable manager level job, but I was making 6 figures in Switzerland where salaries are higher. So there's definitely differences between Europe. So if you're in London City or Switzerland or place Luxembourg, you might be making 6 figures, sure. But then if you're in Spain, Italy, many other places, you might be making 20 to 30K a year, which is, by the way, somewhat similar in the US, although US has more of these hubs and a lot of, particularly in tech, their offices might have slightly lower salaries in the lower cost cities and states, but not materially different, especially after COVID. But yeah, if you're in New York and you have a starting level job, you might be earning more than if you would have a starting level job in Indiana. Okay, so that's your gross salary. Then taxes. So in the US, you have 2 kinds of taxes. You have the federal taxes and you have the state taxes. Estate taxes is actually more complicated than just the income tax. I live now in Texas, where it's one of the states that doesn't have an income tax, along with places like Nevada, Washington, and Wyoming. But then they have high other taxes, property taxes, sales taxes. So it's like the total tax load. But it's not that different from Europe, where you have VAT, for example. So in Finland, the total taxation is extra high because you have high income taxes and then you have VAT taxes. VAT means value-added taxes, and there are different percentages for different types of products. Without making it too complicated, basically like the government is incentivizing people to buy certain goods and other goods are higher. Let's say alcohol, tobacco, gas might have higher percentages. It's not as black and white as that, but it is like a sales tax or GST tax that you have in Canada. Now, what was hard when moving into the US is that in the US, they give you the pre-tax number. They quote you in a restaurant or whatnot, they give you the pre-tax number, versus in Europe, they give you the post-tax. Unless you do B2B, and that's where the VAT really differs from the sales taxes. You can get it back. It's like a balance, debits and credits, but as a consumer, you always pay it. So US taxes, you pay the federal no matter what, and you pay the state, whatever it is. The highest in California goes up to 13%, and then as low as 0%. And in both taxes, federal and state are progressive. Very similar to Europe, usually progressive taxation, except the EU doesn't really tax you. It's just the country. And the taxes differ a lot. Generally, like the more welfare-based countries like the Scandinavia, taxes are higher. And then there are some countries that are trying to incentivize people to move there that might have taxes that are lower. Switzerland would be an example of a country where you would have lower taxes. So in the US, as an example, if you would have a $100,000 salary, you would probably pay about 22% marginal tax rate, but the effective tax rate would be about 15% on the federal side. Then on the state side, if you live in like place like California, marginal will be 10%, effective maybe 6%. And so the total kind of effective tax rate on that 100K would probably be about 28%. So 28,000. And then if you'd be in a place like Texas, it would probably be about 22%. So you would pay either maybe 28,000 in taxes in California and 22,000 in Texas. Now in Europe, you might actually have in many countries a lower percentage than 22% for a similar kind of a job. What would be a 100K job in the US is probably a 40K job in Europe. But the percentage might be slightly lower. Again, huge differences between countries. But in the US, you have a lot more tax deductions. If you're married, if you have kids, if you have property, if you have deductions, there's a lot in real estate. I've been able to get so many of the tax deductions that my tax percentage is much lower than in Europe. So what's actually kind of crazy is that US, you might have 2 times higher salaries, sometimes 3, 4, 5 times higher salaries, but also like what you pay in taxes might be lower. So the net is much, much higher in the US. I think for a lot of people, it will be 3 times the salary, what you net in the US versus what you would net in Europe. A lot of people just look at the on paper tax rates and compare them US and Europe, and they're like somewhat comparable. In some cases, even US being higher. But in reality, most people in the US are paying less in taxes than Europeans. Now, you could argue that you do get more bang for your buck in Europe, though, with those tax dollars, because free healthcare, free education are pretty common, or at least highly discounted healthcare, highly discounted education, versus in the US, you do pay everything out of pocket, which is what we're going to talk about next, is expenses. So before we even get to the expenses, we got to talk about the starting point. So for most people, I'm using this kind of average, is you go to college or some sort of junior college and you graduate. In Europe, you're graduating with no student debt, or maybe some thousands of dollars that you took to pay for your accommodation during that education. But education is free or highly discounted. And a lot of people actually work a little bit during it to pay for that education and living expenses. Versus in the US, it's very common that you get a big student debt, usually in the 6 figures. It's very common to have 100,000, even if you didn't go to a fancy college, but like anywhere from 50 to 200K is pretty normal as a starting point. And that's actually like pretty aggressive debt, because even if you file a personal bankruptcy, you still owe it. Now, some of the debts are with federally backed. It might be pretty affordable, like 2 to 3% of interest. And then others have more aggressive 5 to 8%. Now, you might defer the principal payments for a long time. There's a lot of support there, but you're still building up interest. So after 10 years of paying it back, you might have not actually paid any of it back yet. So the next big bucket besides just debt from education is accommodation. Buying a place in US is not that different from buying a place in Europe. Now, within Europe, there's obviously affordable houses too. A lot of people on Instagram love to refer to these like mansions in France that you can buy for a few $100,000. By the way, good luck with the maintenance of those and the paperwork required. But yeah, there's affordable housing. But at the same time, if you start looking around the US, there's a lot of affordable housing too. Some places, they give you a free house if you move there. There's highs and lows both ways. But if I compare even like New York City prices of buying an apartment versus Helsinki, and Helsinki is not like the fanciest or most expensive place, they're pretty comparable. So the cost of buying a house is fairly comparable. Now, for example, in Finland, interest rates are slightly lower than they are in the US, maybe because US banks take more risk and more people default. And in Europe, or in at least this case in Finland, most people pay back their mortgage. And if the bank would have to take the house back, they wouldn't lose money on it versus US, maybe there's more volatility. So the cost of buying a place is fairly comparable, but renting is significantly cheaper in Europe than it is in the US. When I was in college, I was paying 500 euros a month to live with a roommate in a city center. Once I graduated, I was paying anywhere between 800 to 1,200 euros a month to live by myself. And then if you get a house, you're unlikely to pay more than 2,000. Now move to the US. Like I was paying 1,500, 2,000 to live with a roommate in New York City. When I was living by myself, it was between 2,000 to 4,000, mostly what I was paying both in LA and New York. Now, these are more expensive places, but even in Austin, it's not that crazy to pay 2,000 to 5,000 a month to rent a place. And if you want a house, it's probably like 4,000 to 8,000. So the cost is much higher to rent, even if buying would be comparable. The other thing that's pretty stark difference is in Europe, people have a lot less square footage. Like having 1,000 square feet house or apartment in Europe is massive. Here, it's the smallest you can get pretty much. So the differences between size and how many bedrooms there are, how much garage or storage space, Americans just have a lot more. That's partly explains also the cost difference. So the per square feet or square meter prices are maybe not that different, but people just have a lot more space. There just isn't inventory for a small apartment that you can find in Europe, especially in city centers, maybe somewhere in New York or San Francisco. But generally, people have a lot more space, more things, so that ends up with higher rent too. Okay, then transportation. First of all, in Europe, a lot of people don't have a car. Or if you have a car, you have one car. And if you have a car, you probably use, even though the same car in Europe might be more expensive than in the US, the car prices are much lower for the exact same car. But what people actually end up buying is partly because the lower salaries, higher taxes, people buy cheaper cars, smaller cars. It's like a family of 5 might have a little teeny sedan or hatchback versus in the US, you have a big SUV, Suburban or something like that, or truck. That makes a huge difference on also car payments. So generally, a lot of my friends didn't have cars until well into their 30s, versus in the US, it's very common at 16 to 18 already to get a car, with the car payments here in the US often being 500 to 1,000. Now, if you look at the historicals, that will show you a lower number. That's not my experience, partly maybe because of COVID and the current finances, but a lot of people I know have a car payment even excess of $1,000 a month. Versus my European similar quality educated, they buy cars with cash, or if they get a lease, it's like 200 to 300 a month type of a lease or a car payment, versus in the US, like it's rare to see people with under $500 payments. Again, part of that is explained with more expensive, bigger cars, bigger engines, even though like probably otherwise US system is more affordable with cars. So the gas, on the other hand, is a lot cheaper in the US, especially in Texas. I've had friends and family visit and they're like, is the gas a little expensive? It looks, like $2, $2.50 versus in Europe, it might be €2. And they're like, that's a little expensive here. But in Europe, it's a liter and here it's a gallon. So that just means it's over 3 times cheaper in the US usually to get gas than in Europe. The other thing is food. Food is significantly cheaper in Europe than it is in the US. And that's kind of crazy because generally I would say the food is also cleaner, healthier, and better quality in Europe. You go to the grocery store and it's hard to leave with over €100 purchase. Like it's very common for a family of 2 to just spend like 30 to 50 euros. Like again, 100 maybe for a family of 4, 150. Versus in the US, you go not even to Costco or anything. It's very common to spend like 300 to 500. So I think a big family of 4 with dogs in Europe, you would spend maybe 1,000 euros a month on everything. Like that's like splurging on organic goods. And in the US, that might be 2,000 to 3,000. Now in the US, there is some really affordable food too. Like think of Walmart, think of Costco deals. So you can live with very little. And there's food stamps and low quality products. But then I think you're really getting the absolute bottom feed things. The other one is education, especially if you have kids. In Europe, for example, Finland, you have free education, K through 12. You also have free daycare. The government has to make sure you have daycare for the full time, versus here, you end up spending tens of thousands a year for daycare and school. In some cases, there's public schools, but the quality of public education in the US is much, much lower than it is in Europe. And if you end up being actually in a good public school district, then often the real estate prices are much higher. So for example, here in Austin, Texas, there is an Eanes school district with very famous schools like Westlake and Lake Travis. And those schools are good public schools, but then they also have very expensive real estate, sometimes 2-3 times what they would be in another region. So you pay it in other ways. Versus in Europe, you have great public schools. Basically in Finland, everyone goes to a public school and it's free. You actually also get free food in the school, which is not common always in the US. So you get a free meal, education, and you don't have to pay any. The other thing besides taxes that people don't often talk about is that in Europe, it's also very common to pay for the church tax. It's become more and more common. People leave the churches because of this reason, but a lot of people, religious or not, are part of a church and they end up paying a tax too. In some countries in Europe, this is more common. Versus the US, people donate and they get charity, they get a tax deduction from it. So it's slightly more of like volunteer-based type of a church payment, versus in Europe, it actually kind of goes directly based as a percentage of your income. Okay, so we have income, we have taxes, we have accommodation, we have transportation, we have food. The other stuff like hobbies in Europe generally are a lot cheaper. There's a lot of clubs where even like if you play the most expensive sport in Europe, it's like a hockey thing. It's like a few thousand euros a year. Versus here, like the most expensive hobbies, like the horses, can be hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. It's kind of crazy. So in Europe, you have a lot more affordable hobbies for kids and adults. And like for a gym membership, the fanciest gym membership I had in Europe was 50 euros a month. And that was like kind of bougie. Here, the highest I paid is 500 a month, which is a big difference, a 10x difference. Sure, there's cheap gyms in US too for like Planet Fitness or other places like that. But it is common in the US that hobbies cost more. Same kind of with travel, although flights are fairly comparable. Like in the US, if you're not traveling on the peak days, you can $200, you can in economy, you can get almost anywhere. Similarly in Europe, for 200 euros, you can pretty much fly to most places unless again, it's peak season. But then once you get there, like a really high-end hotel in Helsinki, Finland is 100 a night. And here it's 300 to 500 a night, again, on a high end. So in general, like for hotels, Europe is a lot cheaper and better quality, but flights and also I guess car rentals are fairly comparable in the two regions. I think the bigger issue is Americans feel pressure to spend more and do more, even though Europeans would say Americans don't travel much, but Americans have a very busy schedule and they spend a lot more time on things like sporting events and things that cost a lot of money, going to Disneyland. Again, I think that requires a separate video with kids. But in Europe, people are more conscious about hobbies cost and travel cost. Even if they end up going the same amount, they just do cheaper trips. Okay, as a summary, while trying to be universally helpful, again, I understand that some people are making 50K and some people are making 250K, but using kind of round numbers, in Europe, I would be making roughly 40K for the job that in the US, I would be making 100K. So salaries are at least double in the US than they are in Europe for similar jobs. And the further you're in a career, the more you're making in the US compared to Europe. Then on the taxes side, if I would have a 100K salary in Finland and a 100K salary here in the US, on paper, especially if I would live in California, I would pay slightly higher taxes in California and slightly lower taxes in Texas. But you could say that taxes in the US are actually higher for that amount. But in reality, after you put all the deductions and how the tax system works, you end up actually paying less. So maybe 20 to 22% of your income in taxes, versus in Europe, you'll probably be paying 30 to 35% for that amount in taxes. So just because of the tax deductions in the US, I would generally say about 10% points less in taxes that you're paying. Again, depends a lot on the country and state you're in. As far as accommodation, buying is very comparable, slightly lower interest rates in Europe and in the US, but rent is significantly cheaper in Europe. I would say like 2 to 4 times cheaper what people pay. Again, Europeans tend to have smaller houses and apartments than in the US, but nevertheless, rents are a lot cheaper in Europe and you end up spending probably the same percentage of your salary or slightly less than Americans. So call it 20, 30% of your salary might go into accommodation, but Europeans just have a lot smaller places. Transportation, I think Americans spend at least double on cars. Gas is slightly cheaper. Maybe you have other toll roads and other costs in Europe that you don't have in the US. But I would generally say that in Europe, you would spend $300 to $500 maybe on a car payment a month versus here it's closer to $1,000 with gas and insurances. Food in general, I would say, again, in the US is twice the cost. So having, $1,000 monthly bill for groceries is not that crazy. And Europe, you'd probably be spending $500 or less for better quality food. It depends where you shop. Is it Whole Foods? Or is it Walmart? But nevertheless, I would say double the cost in the US. And again, probably getting less quality products for that money. Air travel and car rentals in the US and Europe are fairly comparable. And I would say generally hotels are maybe half the price in Europe than they are in the US, with some notable exceptions. But then Americans end up traveling more, which sounds crazy to Europeans who think Americans don't travel, but it's more domestic travel and other hobbies. So it's easy to spend 10 to 20% of your salary on hobbies and things like that. Now, you would say that Americans can't even afford them and they're in more debt than Europeans, which is also true, but that's roughly what people spend on hobbies and travel. Obviously, varies a lot by person, but in the US, there's more pressure to do these things. And even let's say ski tickets, if you go ski in Europe, they're often 2 to 3 times cheaper than what the ticket prices are in the US resorts. So that also adds up. So as a summary, in the US, I make more, I pay less in taxes, I pay more for accommodation, I pay more for food, probably worse quality, I pay a lot more for education, but a net, I would say generally in the US, you end up netting more if you're careful, but if you let the American culture drive your expenses, you actually end up saving less, and therefore Europeans actually have better saving rates. Okay, that was it. Hopefully that was helpful and you learned something. If you're an American looking to move to Europe, you'll be probably very disappointed by the income and salary that get offered. But if you actually live there and you live the typical European way, you might actually saving more in Europe than you would in the US. But if you're cost conscious and you do even a half decent job at looking at your expenses, the higher salaries and lower taxes in the US will give you more leverage. So generally, I would say build your career in the US and then retire in Europe and enjoy the lower cost of living, and some say better quality of living Europe has to offer once you've made your money. But if you wanna build wealth and save money, US is better as long as you stay disciplined and avoid the cost bloat. Thanks for joining for this video. Hit like and subscribe and check out some of the other videos with similar topics down below. Ciao, ciao.